On the night of August 29th, 1988, a stocky, gray-haired man walked out of his house in the Flatlands section of Brooklyn and headed toward his car, the way he had done thousands of times before. He did not make it. Two gunmen were waiting, and within seconds, 19 rounds had been fired into his body. He was hit twice in the back, once in each thigh, and at least 6 times in the head. Before the shooters fled, they dropped a scattering of jack-like spikes on the roadway behind them, a small professional touch meant to blow out the tires of anyone foolish enough to give chase. The man who died on that stretch of pavement was named Wilfred Johnson, though almost nobody who knew him used that name. He was called Willie Boy, and for 19 years, from 1966 to 1985, he had been one of the most productive informants the Federal Bureau of Investigation ever ran inside an American crime family, feeding agents information on a childhood friend who would go on to become the most famous mobster of his generation, a friend he never stopped protecting even while he was betraying him. The friend was John Gotti. And what makes Willie Boy Johnson's story remarkable is not simply that he talked. Plenty of men talked over the decades to the agencies chasing organized crime in New York, and their stories tend to follow a familiar shape: exposure, protection, a new identity, a quiet disappearance from the world that once tried to kill them. What makes Johnson's story remarkable is what happened after he stopped being useful in the way the government had intended, after his own name was read aloud in a federal courtroom by a prosecutor who wanted to force his hand, after the men he had spent nearly 2 decades betraying learned exactly what he had done. He was offered a way out. The Witness Protection Program existed for precisely this situation, a mechanism built to erase a man like Willie Boy Johnson and give him a new name, a new town, a new life, far from Brooklyn and far from the people who now had every reason to kill him. He refused. He stayed. He kept walking to that same car, on that same street, for 3 more years, until the night the two men were waiting for him. Before we get to why a man would spend 19 years secretly working against his own crew and then refuse the one offer that might have saved his life, tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this one delivered the same way, go ahead and subscribe now. Now, back to Brooklyn and the long, strange double life of Willie Boy Johnson, a story that begins not with betrayal, but with two poor kids from two broken homes finding each other on the same block. Wilfred Johnson was born on September 29th, 1935, the child of a mismatched pairing that shaped everything about how he would later be treated inside the world he chose to enter. His father was part Native American, a construction worker in the Iron Workers Union, a man with a serious drinking problem who beat his wife and children with some regularity. His mother was Italian American, and it was her heritage that would matter far more to Johnson's future than his father's, because in the ethnic arithmetic of the American Mafia in the middle of the 20th century, a man's bloodline determined the ceiling of his career before he ever threw a punch or moved a stolen truck. The family settled in Red Hook, Brooklyn, and later in Canarsie, and Johnson grew up the way a great many boys in those neighborhoods grew up in that era, which is to say, surrounded by an economy of theft, hustle, and small violence that existed alongside the legitimate one and often crossed over it without much friction. His father's alcoholism shaped the household in ways that went beyond ordinary hardship. The elder Johnson drank away much of what he earned as an iron worker, and when he drank, he turned on his wife and children with a regularity that left the household in a nearly constant state of instability. Wilfred's mother, for her part, would periodically leave the family altogether for stretches of time before always returning, a pattern that gave the Johnson children a childhood defined by absence and unpredictability on both sides of the marriage. It was, by any standard, a difficult beginning, and it produced in Wilfred Johnson a boy who found in the streets a form of order and reward that the house he grew up in could not reliably provide. He started early. At 9 years old, Johnson was arrested for stealing money out of the cash register at a candy store that doubled as a hangout for the enforcement crew known as Murder Incorporated, a detail that tells you something about the ecosystem a 9-year-old boy in that part of Brooklyn was already breathing. At 12, He either fell or was pushed off the roof of his school during a fight, and the head injuries from that fall gave him headaches that would follow him for the rest of his life. By the time he reached his late teens, Johnson was already running a loosely organized gang of young men in East New York, building the kind of reputation on the street that made him a natural recruit once the older, established crews around Brooklyn started looking for reliable muscle. He worked for a time as a crane operator with the Operating Engineers Union, a legitimate trade that ran in parallel with the criminal one, the same pattern that shows up again and again in the biographies of men who eventually chose the second path over the first. It was in that overlapping world, on the streets around the Fulton Rockaway gang, that Johnson met a younger teenager named John Gotti. Gotti's own household was, if anything, harder than Johnson's. A family crowded into a series of tenements, while his father drifted between low-paying jobs and long stretches of nothing at all, leaving the older sons to find money in the streets because there was rarely enough of it coming through the front door. The two boys became friends the way boys in that world became friends, through shared petty theft, shared street reputation, and a shared understanding of which older men in the neighborhood mattered and which did not. Gotti was younger than Johnson by several years, and in the earliest version of their friendship it was Johnson who carried the greater standing, already known on the corners for the kind of physical willingness that got a young man noticed by the crews running numbers and loans out of the local social clubs. When Gotti eventually made his way into the Gambino crime family, initiated into the offshoot that fed directly into the larger organization, he remembered his old friend from the neighborhood, and Johnson came along with him, absorbed into the same crew, the Bergen crew, that Gotti would one day command as a captain. The crew took its name from the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club, a storefront social club in Ozone Park, Queens, that functioned as headquarters for a rotating cast of gamblers, loan sharks, and hijackers who reported, in one line or another, up through the Gambino hierarchy. It was an unglamorous outpost of a very large and very profitable organization, and it was there, among the folding chairs and the card games, that the two boyhood friends from Brooklyn settled into the roles that would define the rest of both their lives, one of them destined to become the most photographed mobster in American history, the other destined to spend 19 years working quietly against him from only a few feet away. But the arithmetic of bloodline never changed. Johnson's father's ancestry meant he could never be formally initiated as a made member of the Gambino family, no matter how much money he brought in or how much violence he was willing to provide. He became known on the street by a cruel shorthand, referred to as the half-breed or the Indian, and inside the crew he earned a separate nickname, the Terminator, for his willingness to handle the kind of physical work that got attached to a man who was useful precisely because he did not ask questions. He was given a modestly profitable gambling operation to run so that he would have a steady income, and by every account he brought in money, as well as any of the men who did carry the formal rank. He was denied. He was, in the language later used by people who studied his case, exactly what the family needed, and exactly what the family would never fully accept, a man positioned permanently on the inside of the operation and permanently on the outside of its inner circle. By the time he reached his mid-40s, that willingness to handle the rough side of the business had put a substantial amount of time on Johnson's own personal record. Across a criminal career that stretched back to his childhood, he had accumulated roughly 18 years behind bars in total, spread across convictions and sentences for assault, robbery, and at least one killing carried out on the crew's behalf, a tally that made him, by any measure, one of the more seasoned and battle-tested men in Gotti's orbit, and one whose experience with the inside of a prison cell rivaled or exceeded that of most of the made men he was never permitted to formally join. Over the years, as Gotti's own standing rose, Johnson served him in a rotating set of practical roles, at various points acting as his driver, his bodyguard, and when the job required it, his gunman, the kind of trusted, hands-on utility that a captain reserves for a man he does not have to explain himself to. Fatico himself, the captain both men answered to during this period, was an old-school Gambino figure who ran the Bergen crew's day-to-day operations through the 1960s and into the 1970s, a man whose own legal troubles would eventually open the door for Gotti's rapid promotion within the crew, but who in these earlier years still held the kind of unquestioned authority over Johnson and his contemporaries that made his broken promises carry real weight when they finally came. It was under Fatico's captaincy that both Johnson and Gotti learned the practical mechanics of the business, the loan sharking arithmetic, the gambling operations, the informal courts where disputes between associates were settled without ever touching the legitimate justice system, and it was against Fatico's failure to honor the crew's own internal code that Johnson would eventually measure his decision to cross over into cooperation with the government. That contradiction sat quietly for years. It did not explode into anything until Johnson found himself, in the middle 1960s, arrested and convicted for armed robbery and facing a prison sentence. This was the moment, according to the Mafia's own internal code, when the organization was supposed to prove its loyalty back to him. The custom was straightforward. When a soldier or associate went away, his capo regime was responsible for making sure the man's wife and children were financially supported while he served his time. Johnson's captain, a man named Carmine Fatico, gave that assurance to Willie Boy directly. He promised to look after Johnson's wife and their 2 infant children. He did not keep the promise. Within a relatively short period, the support dried up, and Johnson's wife, a woman who had remained loyal to him through every one of his prison terms before and after, was forced onto public welfare to keep the household running. For a man who had spent years absorbing every insult the organization's hierarchy could throw at him, from the ethnic slurs to the permanent denial of maid status, this was the breach that finally mattered. It was not an abstract grievance about respect. It was a concrete failure to feed his children. Sitting in prison with that betrayal fresh in his mind, Johnson was approached by federal agents who had noticed, during an earlier interview in 1967, a certain dissatisfaction in the way he talked about the men he worked for. The approach did not come out of nowhere. By the middle of the 1960s, the Bureau had begun formally cultivating a category of informant it called top echelon, a designation reserved for sources positioned close enough to organized crime leadership that their information could be treated as strategic rather than merely tactical, and agents in the field were understanding instructions to keep an eye out for associates whose circumstances made them receptive to an approach. Johnson's circumstances, a broken promise from his own captain, and a wife on public assistance were exactly the kind of opening the program was designed to exploit. The Federal Bureau of Investigation offered him a trade, help in return for the dropping of some pending counterfeiting charges against him. Johnson was reluctant at first. Becoming an informant against the very organization that had raised him from a teenage thief into an adult earner was not a decision made lightly, even by a man who had genuine cause for resentment, and the men who ran him understood that Johnson's motives were never purely transactional. He wanted, in his own words to his handlers, to pay the Gambinos back for their dishonesty, a grievance framed less in the language of law enforcement than in the language of a man settling a personal account. But between the wish to even the score with Fatico and the practical benefit of the drop charges, he agreed. The Bureau gave him a file number, BQ5558-TE, the letters standing for top echelon, the designation reserved for informants considered valuable enough to run at the highest level of Bureau attention. They gave him a code name as well, one drawn directly from his Native American ancestry, the same heritage that had kept him out of the family's formal ranks and earned him the ugly nicknames the men around him used behind his back. Inside FBI paperwork, from 1966 onward, Wilfred Johnson existed as Wahoo, a name chosen by the very institution he had once been denied entry into by blood, now the institution that valued that same bloodline enough to build a case file around it. At home, Johnson's own family bore a quiet resemblance to the household he had grown up in, minus the violence. His wife had stood by him through his earlier prison terms and would go on standing by him through the ones that followed, raising their children largely on her own during the stretches when her husband was away. First at the mercy of a captain who had broken his word about supporting her, and later, unknowingly, married to a man conducting one of the longest-running deceptions of his era from inside their own home. There is no indication in the surviving record that Johnson's wife knew, in the earliest years, exactly what her husband had begun doing for the federal government, and the domestic normalcy of the household, dinners, birthdays, a construction job on the books, sat directly alongside a secret that would eventually cost her husband his life and leave her, along with their children, to absorb the aftermath alone, without the protection her husband himself had once been offered and refused. His handler for most of this period was a special agent named Martin Boland, and the relationship between the two men settled quickly into a rhythm neither the popular image of the informant nor the popular image of the federal agent quite captures. Johnson was not an eager talker looking to unburden himself. Boland later described him as a source who tested the patience of the people running him, arrested at various points on side matters including counterfeiting and receiving stolen property, requiring the kind of ongoing management that made him, in the language later used by writers who covered the case, a genuinely difficult informant to keep functioning. But he was also, by any measure of results, one of the more productive sources the Bureau's Gambino squad had ever developed, and the agents who handled him treated that productivity as worth the difficulty. What followed was not a dramatic defection, but a slow, careful, decades-long habit of selective disclosure. Johnson did not pour out everything he knew the moment he signed on. By every account from the agents who handled him, he rarely volunteered information on his own initiative. He waited to be asked direct questions, and he answered them, which is a very different posture from a man actively hunting for things to report. This distinction mattered enormously for how long he was able to sustain the arrangement, because a source who answers only what he is asked leaves far less of a footprint than one who runs to his handlers with every piece of gossip he overhears. The pattern that emerged over the following years showed a man navigating two loyalties that never fully resolved into one. He would provide the Bureau with concrete, verifiable leads, information that solved real hijackings and real thefts, the kind of intelligence that let the FBI recover stolen shipments and, in cooperation with insurance companies offering rewards for the return of hijacked goods, let Johnson personally collect payouts that in at least one instance reached $30,000. This arrangement worked to everyone's benefit in a way that made it sustainable across so many years. The trucking and insurance companies got their merchandise back, the Bureau got a closed case and a demonstrated track record it could point to internally as justification for continuing to run an admittedly difficult source, and Johnson himself found in the reward system a way to profit from his cooperation without ever having to ask the FBI itself for money, a distinction that mattered to him even if it made little practical difference to the Gambino associates whose stolen goods he was quietly helping recover on the government's behalf. Aside from the dropped counterfeiting charges that started the relationship, he sought almost nothing in the way of direct financial compensation or leniency from the government itself, and on one documented occasion he borrowed $100 from his handler as what he called an emergency personal loan and paid it back promptly, refusing even the offer to skip the customary interest. But when the questions turned toward John Gotti specifically, Johnson grew careful in a way that stood out to the agents who worked with him. He would offer hints rather than direct accusations. He complained more than once about Gotti's gambling habit, telling his handler that his old friend was laying bets as large as $100,000 in a single week, wagers so large that some of the action spilled over onto Johnson's own modest bookmaking operation, forcing him to personally absorb losses generated by a man he was simultaneously informing on, and still, in some complicated way, loyal to. He once told his handler that his feelings about Gotti ran in both directions depending on the day, that there were times he loved the man and times he could not stand him. It is one of the more human details to survive in the record of an informant relationship that is otherwise built almost entirely out of surveillance reports and courtroom testimony. That contradiction, a man reporting on his best friend, while still feeling something like brotherly loyalty toward him, would define the entire arc of what came next, as Johnson's information began to reach further and further into the operational core of the crew he had grown up alongside. By the early 1970s, the value of Johnson's reporting had escalated well beyond stolen shipments and gambling gossip. In May of 1973, John Gotti, along with fellow Gambino associates Angelo Ruggiero and Ralph Gallioni, killed a man named James McBratney inside a bar on Staten Island. McBratney had been connected to the kidnapping and killing of a nephew of Gambino family boss Carlo Gambino, and word inside the family was that Gambino himself wanted the men responsible found and dealt with, a direct order from the top of the organization that the younger members of the Bergen crew were eager to carry out as proof of their reliability. The retaliation was swift and violent, carried out in front of witnesses inside a crowded Staten Island tavern with none of the careful planning that would later characterize the family's most professional killings. Ruggiero and Gallione were quickly identified by a waitress who had witnessed the killing. Gotti's identity, however, remained unknown to investigators for a period of time afterward, a gap that gave him weeks of freedom, while the other two men involved in the killing were already facing scrutiny. It was Willie Boy Johnson, according to records later turned over to Gotti's own defense attorneys once the informant file was disclosed, who provided the information that ultimately led authorities to his childhood friend's whereabouts, closing the very gap that had briefly protected Gotti from arrest. Gotti was eventually located, arrested, and allowed to plead guilty to a reduced charge of attempted manslaughter, a plea bargain that spared him a murder conviction and served instead as his first real credential of toughness within the family, a young made man who had killed on the organization's behalf and served his time without complaint. He served that sentence at Greenhaven Correctional Facility. In one of the era's stranger ironies, Johnson himself was serving a sentence at that same facility for armed robbery during part of that period, meaning the man responsible for delivering Gotti to the authorities spent time behind the same walls as his friend, the two of them living out prison routines together, eating in the same mess hall, walking the same yard, while one of them carried a secret the other did not yet suspect. There is no surviving account of the two men discussing McBratney directly during that shared stretch of incarceration, and the historical record does not establish whether Gotti ever wondered, even privately, how the authorities had found him so quickly. What is documented is that the friendship endured the coincidence entirely intact, and that when both men were eventually released, they returned to the same crew in the same neighborhood, as though nothing about the arrangement between them had changed at all. Johnson's usefulness to the Bureau kept expanding through the decade. He supplied details connecting Gotti and Ruggiero to the killing of a Florida mobster named Anthony Plate, an underworld figure whose disappearance had never been satisfactorily explained by local investigators in the South, and whose case might have gone permanently unsolved without a source inside the New York crew willing to connect the dots for federal agents, working the file from a completely different jurisdiction. He gave agents insight into a large narcotics operation that investigators came to call the Pleasant Avenue Connection, a heroin trafficking network tied to Gotti's crew that would eventually produce major indictments against Ruggiero and Gotti's brother Gene, built substantially around wiretap evidence gathered once the Bureau knew precisely where and how to listen. Castellano himself, the family's boss through most of this period, had forbidden his made men from dealing narcotics under threat of death, a prohibition Gotti's own crew violated repeatedly and concealed from their own leadership almost as carefully as they concealed it from the government, meaning that Johnson's reporting, whatever damage it did to federal prosecutors' understanding of the crew, was in some sense less dangerous to Gotti in the near term than the discovery of the same activity by Castellano would have been. Each of these disclosures represented, in isolation, a serious act of betrayal against men Johnson had known since adolescence. Taken together across nearly 2 decades, they represented one of the most sustained and consequential penetrations of an organized crime family that the Bureau had achieved up to that point, delivered not by a stranger who had infiltrated from outside, but by a man who had been present at the crew's formation and remained embedded in its daily life the entire time. And still, through all of it, Johnson kept doing the work the crew itself required of him, running his gambling operation, handling stolen goods, showing up at the Bergen whenever he was expected to show up, maintaining a front so complete that decades later, when investigators finally sat down to reconstruct exactly what he had told the government, and when even his own former associates struggled to identify the moment his loyalty had actually shifted, because from the outside it appeared never to have shifted at all. The top echelon program that produced Johnson's file was, by the 1970s, already a subject of quiet controversy inside the Bureau itself. The same logic that made an informant like Johnson valuable, deep, long term access to a target that could not otherwise be reached also made him dangerous to run, because every year that passed without exposure increased both the value of what he might still deliver and the severity of what would happen to him if his cover were ever blown. Agents who ran top echelon sources for extended periods often found themselves managing a slow building liability alongside a slow building asset, and the program's own internal guidelines struggled to answer a question that would eventually define Johnson's entire fate. At what point does an informant's usefulness stop justifying the risk of continuing to run him, and who bears responsibility if that risk is realized? Johnson's case would later be cited in law enforcement circles and in academic studies of informant handling as one of the clearest illustrations of exactly how that risk could be realized when institutional priorities, in this instance a prosecutor's desire to force a plea rather than the Bureau's preference for continued patience, overrode the caution that had kept the source alive for nearly 2 decades. The psychological mechanics of Johnson's own arrangement are among the least documented and most fascinating aspects of his story. A man who informs on strangers is engaged in a comparatively simple transaction. A man who informs for 19 years on the people who raised him, employed him, and in at least one case remained. His closest personal friend is engaged in something considerably more complicated, a daily act of compartmentalization that had to survive birthdays, funerals, prison visits, and ordinary nights at the card table without ever slipping. Whatever guilt or strain that arrangement produced in Johnson privately, it does not survive in the written record. What survives is the output, case after case, informant report after informant report, arriving at the Bureau with enough consistency that Special Agent Boland and his supervisors came to regard Wahoo as one of the most reliable long-term assets working inside any of New York's 5 families, and yet Johnson's own position inside the crew never improved. He remained, in the eyes of the men around him, a permanent gopher, useful for handling stolen goods and rough work, but never elevated to genuine standing. He complained to his handler that Fatico and the others still treated him as a peon, still made him handle swag like an errand boy regardless of how much loyalty and earning he had put in over the years. He was heard grumbling that Gotti, despite the expensive suits he had started wearing as he rose through the ranks, was still, underneath the polish, exactly the same rough character he had always been, and that people should not be fooled by the smoother exterior. It is a striking thing to hear from a man who was at that very moment protecting his friend's freedom by withholding information from the government he was otherwise cooperating with. Johnson seemed capable of resenting Gotti and shielding him in the same breath, a balancing act that required a discipline most people never have to test in themselves. That balancing act held for the better part of 2 decades, through prison stays, through promotions on both sides of the relationship, Gotti rising steadily through the Bergen crew while Johnson remained fixed in his subordinate lane. It held through the accumulation of case after case that Johnson's information helped the Bureau build, quietly, without his name ever surfacing in open court. It held, in fact, right up until the moment a federal prosecutor in Brooklyn decided that the fastest way to get Willie Boy Johnson to testify against his oldest friend was to take away the one thing that had let him survive this long, his invisibility. By the early 1980s, John Gotti's rise inside the Gambino family had become impossible to ignore. He had been promoted to captain of the Bergen crew, and his relationship with underboss Agnello Della Croce had made him one of the most closely watched rising figures in New York organized crime. The Bureau's Gambino squad, led by a supervisor named Bruce Mao, had spent years quietly assembling a case against Gotti and his circle, using exactly the kind of long-term informant work that Willie Boy Johnson had spent nearly 2 decades providing. It was patient, methodical, built for the long run, the way institutional investigations tend to be built when they are working correctly. Then, in late 1984, an assistant United States attorney in Brooklyn named Diane Giacalone began preparing her own racketeering case against Gotti, and her approach ran in almost direct conflict with the bureaus. Giacalone had grown up in Ozone Park herself, in the same neighborhood that housed the Bergen Club, and she would later say she had walked past the clubhouse and its regulars for years before ever imagining she would one day be the prosecutor trying to take the whole operation down. She had a reputation as an aggressive and confident litigator, and by the time she turned her attention to Gotti, no defendant had ever successfully beaten a federal case brought under the RICO statute, a fact that gave her considerable confidence going in. Giacalone wanted results on her own timeline, and her timeline did not accommodate the years of patient, incremental work. The Bureau's Gambino squad, under Supervisor Bruce Mao, had already invested in building a case designed to survive appeal and produce convictions that would actually stick. She asked a grand jury to indict Johnson alongside Gotti and several other members of the crew, and she made clear to the Bureau that she intended to disclose Johnson's status as a longtime informant in open court, calculating that once Johnson's cover was blown, he would have no choice but to accept a plea deal, enter the witness protection program, and testify against Gotti as a cooperating witness. It was, on paper, a reasonable piece of prosecutorial logic. An informant facing indictment alongside the men he had been secretly reporting on for years would seem to have every incentive to formalize his cooperation once his cover was gone, rather than face trial as an exposed rat with no protection at all. The Bureau's Gambino squad was furious. Agents who had spent years building trust with Johnson understood, in a way the prosecutor did not seem to, exactly what exposure would mean for a man in his position, and they argued internally that Giacalone's plan treated Johnson's survival as a secondary concern behind the immediate goal of building leverage against Gotti. Mao and his agents pushed back, but Giacalone held her authority to bring the case as she saw fit, and on March 18, 1985, Bureau officials met with her to turn over the informant file the agency had built on Johnson under the code name Source Wahoo. The agents who handed over that file reportedly did so with real reluctance, aware that once it left their hands, they no longer controlled how or when the information inside it would be used, or what it would cost the man it described. On March the 25th, 1985, Johnson's name appeared on a federal indictment alongside John Gotti, Gotti's brother Gene, underboss Della Croce, and Della Croce's son Armand, along with Charles Caneglia, John Caneglia, Anthony Rampino, Nicholas Carrazzo, and Leonard De Maria. 10 men in total, charged with racketeering and conspiracy under the RICO statute, facing potential sentences of up to 40 years and fines as steep as $50,000. When the indictment and the accompanying disclosures became public, the truth that Willie Boy Johnson had been feeding the government information on his own crew since 1966 was no longer a secret the Bureau controlled. It was a matter of public record, read into a courtroom, available to every defense attorney, representing every man Johnson had spent 19 years quietly betraying. The charges themselves were substantial on their own terms, independent of the informant disclosure that would come to overshadow everything else about the case. The 10 men named in the indictment faced 2 counts under the racketeer, influenced and corrupt organization statute, racketeering and conspiracy, carrying potential sentences as long as 40 years and fines as high as $50,000 for each defendant convicted. For Johnson specifically, the indictment meant standing trial as a formal defendant in exactly the kind of case his own information had helped the government build against the others sitting beside him, a position with no precedent in the Bureau's prior handling of top echelon sources. His handler at the Bureau told him plainly what was likely to come next. Johnson's own reaction, relayed afterward by people close to the case, was immediate and grim. He said he expected to be killed and feared his family would be slaughtered alongside him. The recommended path forward was obvious from a survival standpoint. Take a plea, agree to testify, and disappear into the witness protection program before anyone connected to Gotti had time to act. It was, in the most literal sense, exactly the situation the program exists to solve, and Willie Boy Johnson, sitting at the center of that recommendation with a clearer understanding of the danger than almost anyone else in the room, said no. He refused the plea. He refused to testify against Gotti. And in a move that startled almost everyone who had followed his career as a source, he publicly and repeatedly denied that he had ever been an informant at all, standing alongside his co-defendants and insisting the entire disclosure was mistaken or fabricated, even though the government's own paperwork on source Wahoo now sat in the hands of defense counsel. Jury selection for the racketeering trial began in August of 1986, delayed from an earlier date by a car bombing connected to a separate power struggle within the Gambino hierarchy that made Judge Eugene Nickerson wary of seating a jury exposed to the surrounding publicity. In the months before the trial finally opened, Gotti's own legal troubles had compounded further, an unrelated assault and robbery case involving a refrigerator mechanic having ended in dismissal after the alleged victim conveniently lost his memory on the witness stand, a result the local tabloids covered under a front page reading simply, "I forgotti," a pun that only added to the sense building around Gotti that ordinary legal consequences somehow failed to attach to him. When the racketeering trial finally proceeded, Gotti stood in the defendant's chair alongside his brother Gene, alongside Leonard DeMaria, Anthony Rampino, Nicholas Carrazzo, John Carneglia, and Willie Boy Johnson himself, a defendant sitting through his own trial as a publicly unmasked government informant who had refused to cooperate with the very prosecution that unmasked him. It is difficult to overstate how strange that arrangement was, even by the standards of organized crime trials. Johnson sat at the defense table day after day, alongside men who now knew with certainty that he had spent 19 years reporting on them to the federal government, and none of them, at least not inside the courtroom itself, moved against him. The defense strategy, led by attorney Bruce Cutler, was aggressive from the opening statement onward, denying the existence of the Gambino family as an organized entity at all, and framing the prosecution as a personal vendetta pursued by an overzealous government against ordinary men from an ordinary neighborhood. Cutler's team found and cultivated a former government witness named Matthew Trainer, a bank robber who, when the government declined to pay him for his cooperation, turned around and testified for the defense that Giacalone had offered him improper inducements to secure his testimony, a claim that badly damaged the prosecution's credibility in front of the jury and produced exactly the kind of theatrical courtroom moment that kept the trial on the front page for weeks. Trainer was later charged with perjury over those claims, but by the time that came out, the damage to the government's standing with the jury had already been done. Behind the scenes, the outcome was compromised in an even more direct way. A juror named George Pape, who had concealed a friendship with an associate of a Manhattan gang connected to the Gambino family, was reached through that connection and agreed to sell his vote for a payment of $60,000, a fact that would not become public until years later, when Pape himself was convicted of jury tampering in a separate proceeding. At the time, all the jury and the public knew was that deliberations were underway in one of the most closely watched organized crime trials of the decade, with a defendant sitting at the table who had already been publicly identified as a government informant and who had still, remarkably, refused to testify for the prosecution that exposed him. On March 13, 1987, the jury returned not guilty verdicts across the board. Gotti walked out of the courtroom having beaten a federal racketeering case built substantially on the kind of intelligence Willie Boy Johnson had spent 2 decades supplying, though Johnson himself had refused to add his own testimony to the pile that might have sealed it. The New York tabloids, which had already taken to calling Gotti the Teflon Don after the earlier dismissal in the assault case, now had fresh material for the nickname, and Gotti's public profile, already rising, took another step toward the kind of celebrity status no previous Gambino boss had ever cultivated or wanted. Willie Boy Johnson, the informant everyone in the courtroom now knew by name, walked out a free man as well, an outcome nobody could have confidently predicted given what the government had disclosed about him only months earlier, and one that left him in a position no cooperating source in the history of the Bureau's Gambino squad had ever occupied before, publicly exposed, formally acquitted, and still living in the same neighborhood as the men he had spent 19 years betraying. Freedom, in Johnson's case, did not mean safety, and it did not mean restoration. He was banned from the Bergen Club itself, the social clubhouse in Ozone Park that had served as the crew's informal headquarters for years, a sign that whatever affection had once existed between him and Gotti's circle had curdled into something far more guarded. He moved back to his old neighborhood with his wife and children, took a construction job, and by some accounts drifted back into small-scale drug dealing on the side. He was, in effect, a man tolerated rather than trusted, allowed to keep living in the same streets he had grown up in, watched by people who now knew exactly what he had been doing to them for 19 years, and left to wonder day by day whether that toleration would hold. The year and a half that followed the acquittal has always been the hardest stretch of Willie Boy Johnson's story to document with precision, because so much of what happened during it was decided in private conversations that left no surveillance tape and no court transcript behind. What can be said with confidence is that Gotti's position inside the Gambino family had transformed dramatically in the time since Johnson's exposure. In December of 1985, Gambino boss Paul Castellano had been shot to death outside a Manhattan steakhouse in a killing orchestrated at Gotti's direction, and Gotti had assumed control of the family in the aftermath, moving from a captain running a single crew to the head of what was, by most law enforcement assessments, the most powerful organized crime family in the country. A man in that position had far more at stake in how a known informant in his orbit was handled than a mere captain would have had, and far more capacity to act on whatever decision he reached. Accounts that later emerged from cooperating witnesses inside the Gambino organization, including underboss Sammy Gravano, described Gotti as increasingly anxious not about whether Johnson had already caused damage, since the racketeering acquittal suggested the damage had been survivable, but about what Johnson might still do if circumstances changed. A cornered informant who has already been publicly exposed and who is facing renewed legal pressure has every incentive to finally accept the plea deal he once refused, entering protective custody and delivering the kind of first-hand testimony that no wiretap can fully replace. Gravano would later describe conversations in which Gotti weighed exactly this risk, worried that a failed attempt on Johnson's life might push him directly into the arms of the government he had spent years quietly serving and publicly denying. There were reportedly additional pressures as well, arriving from outside the Gambino family entirely. Reports later surfaced that Johnson had also passed along information touching on the son of imprisoned Colombo boss Carmine Persico, and that the younger Persico, Alphonse, had grown impatient, watching a known informant continue to walk free in Brooklyn while carrying knowledge that could implicate families beyond the Gambinos alone. Whether that outside pressure was the deciding factor or simply one more voice adding urgency to a decision Gotti's own circle was already leaning toward, the record does not establish with certainty. What is clear is that by the summer of 1988, whatever patience had allowed Johnson to survive the year and a half since his exposure had run out, and the calculation inside the Gambino leadership had shifted decisively from tolerating the risk to eliminating it. For Johnson himself, that year and a half must have been lived under a kind of pressure that is difficult to fully reconstruct from the outside. He had been publicly named as an informant, had stood trial alongside the men he had informed on, had watched all of them walk free alongside him, and had then returned to an ordinary life in an extraordinary situation, banned from his old clubhouse, but still living on his old block, still raising his children a short walk from men who now knew precisely what he had spent 19 years doing to them. Whatever conversations he may have had with his own family about leaving, about accepting the protection the government had offered and never withdrawn, do not survive in any documented form. What survives is the outcome, a man who kept showing up day after day in the same neighborhood until the neighborhood finally caught up with him. The narcotics case Johnson had helped build against the Pleasant Avenue connection, the trafficking network his information had first exposed years earlier, continued working its way through the courts across these same years, and it produced its own quiet postscript on the theme of loyalty and its limits inside the Gambino family. Angelo Ruggiero, Gotti's close friend, and the man whose recorded conversations had done so much to expose the heroin operation in the first place, was eventually convicted alongside Gene Gotti, though repeated efforts to compromise the jury produced mistrials that delayed a final resolution for years. By the time Ruggiero was finally released from custody in 1989, he was dying of cancer, and Gotti, who blamed him for much of the legal trouble that had plagued the family since the early 1980s, refused to see him or take his calls. When Ruggiero finally died, associates later said Gotti had to be all but dragged to the funeral of a man who had once been among his closest friends. It was a reminder, arriving almost simultaneously with the final chapter of Willie Boy Johnson's own story, that loyalty inside the Gambino hierarchy during this period was consistently more conditional and more easily withdrawn than the family's public reputation for brotherhood liked to suggest. Whatever combination of calculation and impatience finally tipped the decision on Johnson specifically, it was made. The order to kill Willie Boy Johnson passed down through the chain in the way orders of that kind typically did in the Gambino organization, delegated rather than personally executed, distance from the man who ultimately authorized it by at least one layer of intermediaries. The assignment reportedly went to a Bonanno family associate named Thomas Patera, a man who had grown up in the Gravesend section of Brooklyn, been bullied as a boy for a high-pitched voice that never matched the menace he would later carry as an adult, and built a personal reputation on his skill with karate and other martial arts, a skill that earned him nicknames on the street, built around the idea of a quiet, disciplined, almost surgical approach to violence. By the late 1980s, Patera had become a main member of the Bonanno family and had already begun developing, largely outside the knowledge of his own leadership, an independent drug operation and a personal body count that would eventually place him among the most prolific killers ever produced by any of New York's 5 families. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of contractor a family looking to distance itself from a sensitive piece of business might seek out, a made man from a different family entirely, willing to take on the job as what investigators would later describe as a favor between crews, working alongside a second gunman named Vincent Giattino. Whether the order to use outside talent from another family was intended to insulate the Gambino leadership from direct exposure, or simply reflected the practical realities of who was available and trusted to carry it out, the record does not fully establish. What is established is that by the late summer of 1988, the arrangement was in place, and Willie Boy Johnson, still living in his old Brooklyn neighborhood with his wife and children, still walking to his car most evenings the way he always had no formal protection standing between himself and whatever was coming. On the evening of August 29th, 1988, Johnson left his house in the Flatlands section of Brooklyn and walked toward his parked car, the same short stretch of pavement he had crossed thousands of times across a lifetime spent in that neighborhood. Neighbors would later tell investigators it was an ordinary summer evening. Nothing about the block that suggested anything unusual was about to happen. The 2 gunmen who had been described at the very start of this account were waiting for him, and the volley that followed unfolded exactly as it had already been recounted, over in a matter of seconds. Johnson's family, inside the house only moments earlier, heard the shots and came outside to find him where he had fallen. Police and federal investigators opened an inquiry into the killing almost immediately, and the obvious question of motive required very little speculation given how publicly Johnson's history as an informant had already been laid out in the 1985 indictment and the 1986 trial. Investigators privately concluded that the hit had almost certainly been authorized somewhere near the top of the Gambino hierarchy, a natural inference, given who Johnson had spent 19 years informing on, and who now controlled the organization he had betrayed. But an inference is not evidence, and nothing directly tied John Gotti himself to the order, a gap in the documentary record that has never fully closed. The surviving record does not establish exactly how far the initial investigation into the shooting proceeded before it stalled, only that it did stall, in the way so many inquiries into Gambino family violence had stalled before it. Detectives canvassed the block, found witnesses reluctant to describe anything they might have seen, and ran into the same wall of silence that had frustrated investigators trying to make cases against the Gambino family for decades, a silence that held just as firmly here as it had held through every prior investigation into the family's business. No one was arrested in the days or weeks immediately following the shooting. The same code of silence that had protected the family through years of federal scrutiny closed over Willie Boy Johnson's murder just as effectively as it had closed over everything else. And for a long stretch afterward, the case sat exactly where so many mob killings before it had sat, acknowledged, understood in broad outline by everyone who followed organized crime in New York, and formerly unsolved. Johnson's funeral drew a small crowd, a marked and telling contrast to the elaborate, heavily photographed farewells the Gambino family would stage in later years for men who died in far more favorable standing. He was buried the way he had lived for much of his adult life, on the margins of an organization that had used him for decades without ever fully accepting him, and even in death, the question of which side he had truly belonged to, the family that raised him or the government that ran him, remained every bit as unresolved as it had been on the night he died. His widow and children were left to absorb both the loss and the public record of exactly what he had been doing for the federal government since before some of them had been born, a revelation that had already been sitting in newspapers and court transcripts for 3 years by the time he died, and that would now attach itself permanently to the family name regardless of how much of the true balance sheet, betrayal against betrayal, loyalty against loyalty, ever became fully known to the public that read about it, or to the neighbors who had watched him walk the same block for so many ordinary years. Johnson's refusal to disappear stands out even against the broader history of Mafia informants stretching back decades before his own case began. Joseph Valachi, whose 1963 testimony before a Senate committee had first introduced the American public to the internal structure and vocabulary of the Mafia, had accepted exactly the kind of arrangement Johnson turned down, living out the remainder of his life under federal protection, isolated from the world he had once belonged to, but alive because of that isolation. Later cooperating witnesses, including men from Johnson's own era such as Sammy Gravano, would follow a similar path once they finally decided to break with their families, accepting new identities and relocation as the price of the information they handed over. Johnson's case sits apart from both of these patterns precisely because he never fully crossed the line those men eventually crossed. He had spent 19 years informing without ever formally becoming a cooperating witness in the courtroom sense, and when the government finally asked him to complete that transition, the one that came bundled with protection, he could not bring himself to do it, even with his own life on the line. It would take nearly 2 years for anyone to face formal charges in connection with the killing, and when that reckoning finally arrived, it arrived tangled up with an entirely separate criminal case that had nothing to do with Gotti or the Gambino family at all, a circumstance that would leave the two questions, who ordered Willie Boy Johnson's death and who was ultimately held responsible for it, permanently disconnected from one another in the historical record. In June of 1990, Thomas Patera was indicted on charges connected to a large narcotics trafficking operation he ran out of Brooklyn, along with charges related to 7 separate murders, one of which was the killing of Wilfred Johnson 2 years earlier, a killing that had by then gone unresolved for so long that few outside law enforcement expected it ever to produce charges at all. The broader investigation into Patera revealed a man whose violence extended well beyond anything connected to organized crime discipline in the traditional sense. Investigators alleged he had been involved in as many as 30 killings over the course of his criminal career, many of them tied not to family business but to his own drug operation, which by some estimates moved roughly 220 pounds of cocaine a year, along with substantial quantities of heroin and marijuana. When federal agents searched his Brooklyn apartment, they found more than 60 automatic weapons alongside knives, swords, and books devoted explicitly to assassination and body disposal technique, material that painted a portrait of a man for whom killing had become something closer to a discipline than an occasional necessity. A cooperating witness named Frank Gangi, a member of Patera's own crew, who eventually testified against him to avoid a death sentence of his own, described murders carried out with a level of calculated brutality that shocked even hardened investigators. Victims dismembered and buried in locations Patera believed would accelerate decomposition and defeat identification. The prosecution at Patera's trial, led by an attorney named David Shapiro, argued for the death penalty, describing Patera in open court as a heartless and ruthless killer and walking the jury through, in graphic detail, the deliberate and prolonged manner in which some of his victims had died, including one man Patera was said to have shot 7 separate times in different parts of his body across an extended and calculated sequence, rather than killing quickly. Patera's own defense attorney, David Ruenka, urged jurors to spare his client's life, pointing out that Patera had no criminal record before these charges and that other participants in the same killings had been permitted to plead down to lesser charges in exchange for their testimony. Patera's trial in 1992 produced a conviction on June 25th for 6 of the murders he was charged with, along with the narcotics operation, and the jury later declined to impose the death penalty, resulting in a life sentence handed down that October by Judge Rina Raghi, who told him directly that nobody deserved to die the way his victims had died. Patera reportedly smiled and gave the reporters in the courtroom a thumbs up once the sentence was read, relieved to have escaped execution regardless of what the rest of his life would now look like inside a federal prison. But among the charges the jury considered, the murder of Willie Boy Johnson stood apart from the others. On that specific count, Patera was acquitted. The record does not establish precisely why the jury drew that distinction, whether the evidence connecting him to Johnson's killing was simply weaker than the evidence connecting him to his other victims, whether the passage of 4 years between the murder and the indictment had eroded the reliability of witness memory, or whether some other factor in the testimony created enough doubt to separate that one killing from the rest of the case against him. What can be said is that the man most directly implicated in ordering or carrying out Willie Boy Johnson's death was never convicted of it, and that no one else has ever been convicted of it either. 19 years of quiet, dangerous cooperation with federal law enforcement, followed by a public unmasking, a trial, an acquittal, and a killing carried out with the professional confidence of men who expected to get away with it, ended in a homicide that remains, in the formal language of the justice system, unsolved. The years that followed only sharpened the strange asymmetry at the center of Willie Boy Johnson's story. John Gotti, the friend Johnson had spent nearly 2 decades secretly informing on, would go on to survive the 1987 acquittal by less than 4 years before a new investigation, built on fresh informants and freshly planted listening devices, finally produced the evidence that put him away for good. The Bureau's Gambino squad, chastened by how badly the Giacalone prosecution had gone, and determined not to repeat the same mistakes, spent the years after 1987 rebuilding its case from the ground up, this time relying far more heavily on electronic surveillance than on the fragile human sources that had made the earlier trial so vulnerable to cross-examination and intimidation. Agents identified the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy, Gotti's new headquarters as boss, as the most promising location for a bug, and after early attempts were frustrated by noisy espresso machines and overlapping conversations, they eventually discovered that Gotti's most sensitive discussions were happening not inside the main room of the club at all, but in a rear hallway, and later in an upstairs apartment belonging to the widow of a deceased Gambino soldier. Once agents planted devices in both locations over the Thanksgiving weekend of 1989, they finally began capturing Gotti in his own words, discussing murders, discussing money, and discussing the men beneath him with a directness no informant testimony could have replicated with the same evidentiary weight. By December of 1990, federal agents and New York City detectives raided the club and arrested Gotti, along with his new underboss, Sammy Gravano, and his acting consigliere, Frank Locascio. The recordings played a decisive role in the case that followed, and in a further blow to Gotti's defense, Gravano himself, hearing tapes in which Gotti privately dismissed him as greedy and tried to shift blame for several murders onto him, made the decision to cooperate with the government, becoming the highest-ranking Gambino figure ever to turn state's evidence. In April of 1992, Gotti was convicted on charges that included the murder of Paul Castellano, the very killing that had elevated him to boss in the first place, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would die there a decade later, in June of 2002, the Teflon finally, permanently gone. Diane Giacalone, the prosecutor whose decision to expose Willie Boy Johnson in open court was intended to force his cooperation and instead appears to have hastened his death, saw her own case collapse in an acquittal that became one of the more studied failures in the history of federal organized crime prosecution, remembered less for what it achieved against Gotti than for what it cost the man she had tried to compel into service. The contrast between her approach and the approach the Bureau eventually used to finally convict Gotti has been examined by prosecutors, journalists, and law enforcement historians ever since, not because the comparison is unfair to Giacalone specifically, but because it illustrates so clearly how differently the same target can be pursued depending on whether an investigation leans on the fragile, human, and ultimately fatal instrument of an exposed informant, or on the more durable, if slower, instrument of a well-placed microphone. What Willie Boy Johnson's story ultimately reveals has less to do with the mechanics of organized crime than with the peculiar arithmetic of loyalty under pressure. Here was a man denied full standing in the only organization he had ever belonged to, betrayed by its customary obligations at the exact moment he needed them honored, who chose to spend 19 years quietly working against the men who had denied him that standing, all while maintaining something that still resembled genuine affection for at least one of them. And when the government that had used him for nearly 2 decades finally offered him the one tool explicitly designed to save his life, a new name, a new home, distance from every person who now had reason to want him dead, he refused it and kept walking to the same car on the same street until the night somebody was waiting there for him. Whether that refusal came from loyalty to the old neighborhood, stubborn pride, disbelief that his own people would actually go through with it, or something closer to fatalism, the record does not fully explain, and it never will. What the record does show, without ambiguity, is a man who spent his entire adult life caught between two worlds that both, in the end, used him and then let him go. The organization that raised him from a teenage thief into an adult earner never gave him the one thing he wanted from it, formal acceptance as one of its own, and punished the one obligation it did owe him, support for his family during his imprisonment, by breaking its word the moment it became inconvenient. The government that spent 19 years extracting some of its most valuable intelligence on the Gambino family from him never fully protected him either, exposing his identity for the sake of a single prosecutor's strategy, and then watching, largely powerless, as the consequences of that exposure played out over the following 3 years. Willie Boy Johnson walked between those two failures of loyalty for the better part of his adult life, and in the end, neither one was there to catch him. It is worth remembering, given how much of what eventually brought Gotti down traces back through cases and leads Johnson helped build, that a story's margins are not always where it actually happened. Sometimes they are only where it was allowed to be told, and for nearly 20 years, the men closest to Willie Boy Johnson never once suspected that the margins were, in fact, exactly where the story had been unfolding all along. The car he was walking toward on that August evening in 1988 sat only a short distance from his own front door, a distance he had covered without incident thousands of times before across a lifetime spent on those same Brooklyn streets. It was not a long walk, and it was not, on any ordinary night, a dangerous one. That was, in its own way, the entire point of the arrangement Johnson had spent his life inside of, a world where the most familiar and unremarkable routines, a walk to a parked car, a conversation at a card table, a friendship formed at 17 years old, could conceal for decades the precise nature of what was actually happening beneath them, until the night they finally could not.